So I have this friend who wanted to buy a 3D printer. He didn't know what kind to get, so he asked me. And I asked him what he wanted to print. He said, I don't know. I just want it to look good and be easy. So I told him he should get a resin printer. Let's talk about why. There are a lot of differences between an FDM printer and a resin printer. But if you have to narrow it down, the biggest difference between the two is simply that a resin printer has very little setup and a lot of cleanup, whereas an FDM printer has a ton of setup to do and very little cleanup. So, what makes resin printing so simple? There's not a lot to set up. When you get the printer, you plug it in, you find the files that you want to print online, you load them up into the printing software, whatever that's going to be, and usually there's maybe one or two settings you can mess around with, but most of the time you don't even have to. You just hit print. Now, most files that you print have to have something that holds them up. They have to have a skeleton that holds up the pieces that would normally just be floating in the air. Okay, and those are called supports. And resin printing almost always comes with supports or pre-supported. And if for some reason you get a file that you want to print that doesn't come pre-supported, most of the programs that you'll use have automatic supports that you can put on, and they usually work. I mean, of the hundreds of resin miniatures that I've printed, maybe one or two didn't work, and all I did was just increase the amount of supports, try again, and it worked. And increasing the supports is as easy as, a couple clicks. Printing in resin is super simple. Cleaning it up, on the other hand, is a little more difficult. The way resin works is that you're dealing with a liquid that when it's exposed to UV light, it hardens. The printer lowers a tray down into your vat of resin, and the light comes from below, and slowly that tray lifts out of the resin and pulls whatever you're printing up out of the resin. So when the print's done, it's completely covered in wet resin still. So what you have to do is you have to get it off the plate, move it to some isopropyl alcohol where you'll clean it off. Once it's cleaned, you can dry it, and then you have to cure it again. And how you cure it again is with a UV light. And there's different kits and different things that you can buy to do that. I just have a large light that I end up shining on the print when it's done. And it hardens one last time. And then your print is done and ready to paint. It's a lot of work to clean up. It's time consuming. It's not something you could just immediately do. Whereas, with an FDM printer, you just pull it off the tray and you break off whatever supports are there and it's done. Okay. But like I said, when you're setting up, there's only 2 or 3 things to set up. With an FDM printer, you've got 20 or 30 different things that you need to set up and a lot of trial and error. So when it comes to the 2 printers, resin is just easier. Now, in my last video, we talked a lot about the different places that you can go to get files to print. And the funny thing is all the ones that I mentioned before, I'll include in the links below, because anything you can print on FDM, you can print in resin. Anything you can print in resin, you can print on FDM. The difference is that with an FDM printer, you're not going to get the same quality. You're just not. If you take 4 days to print something that should take 3 hours to print, you can get pretty close. Okay, and that's an exaggeration, but you're just not going to get the quality you are. But you're going to pay for that quality with resin. Okay, and so we'll include those same websites because you can go to all those places. Now, most of those places don't come pre-supported other than Patreon. Patreon, almost any Patreon that I've ever purchased, you go in, you find the models you like, you subscribe to that channel, they deliver them, and they come pre-supported. Now, that's 10, 20, 30, 40 models that are pre-supported, which means all you have to do is get the file, put it into your program for your printer, and then print it. So again, resin's awesome because you don't have to do those supports. Okay, so Patreon is really great. Now, something we didn't talk about too much before is that after the month of that Patreon, those minis are gone, right? And they move on to other minis. Not true. Most Patreons also use what's called My Mini Factory. And My Mini Factory is a website where you can go and you can find these models. The beauty of My Mini Factory is that if you only need one model out of the set and you didn't want to pay, whatever the cost is for the entire set, you can buy just the one model. Sometimes you can even have them made for you. Okay? But My Mini Factory is where most of the Patreons put their old stuff. And so it's awesome to be able to, if you know exactly what you're looking for, you can usually go there and find it. Now, just like how Patreon has subscriptions, My Mini Factory also has subscriptions you can do if you want to that are called tribes. And the tribes are really worth looking into. There's not a ton of them. You can go through them in an afternoon. So if you know what you're looking for, head to Patreon, head to My Mini Factory, and look. Aside from those two websites, the big website that I wanted to bring up was Cults 3D. Cults 3D is another Thingiverse, another Things. The difference is that not all the models there are free. And so there are some models for sale, and so the variety changes. There's a little bit more to look at. And something that we kind of always have to talk about when you talk about Cults 3D, and if you go there, you'll see what I'm talking about, is there are a lot of miniatures that look like Warhammer. So, can you 3D print Warhammer? The answer to that's a little more difficult than I would like it to be, but it's both yes and no. Can you print Warhammer pieces for tournament play? No. Some of your local shops that do tournaments and things like that, small tournaments, may allow it. And usually in the tournament information, they'll put in there that you can bring homebrew pieces, you can bring 3D printed pieces. But usually, any kind of tournament play for Warhammer will outright say that you cannot bring 3D printed models. You have to use the store-bought models. Okay, does that mean you can't 3D print Warhammer models for yourself to put on display? No, of course not. You can. If you have a friend that you want to get into Warhammer, but you don't want to drop $500 to try and convince him or her, then all you have to do is 3D print a small model using proxy pieces, and you can use whatever you want. And keep in mind, the miniatures that you find on Cults 3D, they're not Warhammer miniatures, and most of the time, they will do a good job of telling you that they aren't. The names will be different. Cults 3D does a fantastic job of protecting their content creators, as well as making sure that Warhammer, doesn't get the raw end of the deal. They're not just going to let people sell pieces that have the same names and everything like that, Warhammer, or identical pieces even. These have to be pieces that look maybe a little bit similar, but are different. And so Cults will do a really good job of not allowing those things to be on their website if there's any possibility that Warhammer could come after the creators. And so use that as you will. Can you make pieces? Can you have an army that you printed? Yeah. And you better believe that you can find a full army on Cults 3D. And so whatever you want to print, there's usually a way to find it, and there's usually a way to print it. But keep in mind, certain places it won't be accepted, and others it will. So just make sure you know where you're going when you decide to print something. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is something that I love to print, and I have had so much fun printing, and that is terrain. Now, we've been talking about how you don't need a 3D printer to do these things for tabletop gaming, and you don't. Terrain can be made out of anything from cardboard to paper to styrofoam to whatever you have on hand. You can make terrain out of whatever you want. And, in our next video, we're going to go over that, specifically terrain for dungeon tiles or for, a 4x4 wargaming board. We'll talk about those things, and we'll talk about everything, not just 3D printing. We'll talk about all the different options and how you can make those things quick and easy. Okay. But when it comes to 3D printers, you can 3D print your terrain. And if you Google it for even a minute, you'll see some of the things that people have done. You'll see entire dungeons that have been printed out and put on a table that are 10 feet wide, and that you can move your figures through for the next 3 years or however long it takes you to get through the dungeon. And they're incredible, and it's amazing. It's so awesome to be able to take the world that you're telling about your players and not only tell them about it, but show it to them. And that's one of the things that makes me love 3D printing. Now, should you print your terrain with a resin printer? That's up to you. It's going to cost you a lot. Okay? But is it going to look good? Yeah, it's going to look phenomenal. It's going to look amazing. And the terrain that I have seen printed, it looks great. And you also talk about your minis. Your minis have to stand on something. Those bases, can you 3D print the bases? Of course. Do you use resin or FDM? You use whatever you have available. But again, with resin, they always look good. So, kind of keep that in mind as you're selecting your printer. If you're using resin, maybe it's not worth making the world and just stick to the characters, stick to the monsters, stick to the miniatures, and make your terrain out of other things. Or maybe you just want to have that one ideal, gigantic piece that looks amazing. Congratulations. With a resin printer, you can make it. Thank you so much for joining us here at Pulsegate Gaming, and we hope to see you again on our next video. Until then, just remember, don't spend so much time making your world that you forget to spend time in it.